Hello, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Flex podcast, the PGA edition. I am your host, Bryan. I am joined, as always, by Colin Davey and Peter Jennings, aka CSU Ram 88. We've been gone for about a month and a half, and we're excited to be back here for the Sony Open as we kick off the 2018 year of golf. Colin, how you doing, man? It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has. I think I'm with everyone else where I just need a slow come down off of Georgia, Alabama last night. Wow, is that one worth staying up for? I am looking forward to Jalen Hurts setting all of the school records at Florida Atlantic later when he needs some playing time and has to get reunited with the family. But in the meantime, that was a great instant classic across the board. I did not have any exposure to that game at all. Pete, do you have anything there?
Yeah, Bovada, Georgia -4 or +4.5. That was a fortunate one, and don't like to tout just winners or whatever, but
that good was line.
Legit arbitrage opportunity. Got to use some Bitcoin, so yeah, that was one of the benefits there of the crypto world. So a lot of worlds converging, and that was quite the sweat. Thought I had it completely locked up. Then the missed field goal was beyond tilting to end regulation. And then after the field goal happened for Georgia, I was feeling pretty good with 4.5 points. So, yeah, it was a great game, great sweat, and instant classic like you mentioned. And how good does Alabama and Saban run? Just incredible. But you got to give them credit to switching the quarterback, which I don't think many coaches would have done.
No, that was one of the ballsiest calls that I will probably ever see. And it was just the correct decision by every conceivable metric. So good on him.
Good on him indeed. All right. I have a couple questions for these guys before we get into this week's Sony Open. Just want to recap the last little bit. Start talking about 2017, then we'll talk about maybe what we've missed in the last month and a half or so. So two questions for these guys. The first one is maybe what are some of the biggest things, or maybe just one thing that you've learned from the 2017 golf DFS season? It could be, like a way that you played in tournaments or a way that you played in cash games. Colin, I'll kick to you first. Is there any lessons that you're taking away into 2018?
Yeah, I'm always trying to adjust mentally that the fundamental GPP art of balancing equity versus ownership. I think I probably have gone maybe a little bit too contrarian in unnecessary spots at certain points. And I'm going to try to maybe take the foot off the gas a little bit more this year. It's definitely something that is no means solved by any stretch, but it's just I think there's I'm definitely looking to get a better understanding and maybe see where that the ownership equity balance breaks down is or is not applicable to certain spots, and just really try to get a more generalized and broadly applicable framework for trading off those two metrics.
Yeah. Pete, what about you? I know that we talk very often about that exact topic of just the equity versus ownership in GPPs in golf is, I think, one of the hardest DFS sports to try to navigate that line.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up as the most important thing for me this year. I probably relied too much on the equity side versus ownership, was getting better at it, especially in higher stakes stuff. But that's definitely going to be the thing I'm most cognizant of and trying to work at the best. Trying to find guys who are very high equity, but for whatever reason, you can gain a lot of leverage. Roster construction some weeks will be a big part of that. Overplaying weather angles, sometimes people do. Underplaying, it's a big one. My favorite thing to do for sure that I'm going to try to identify in good spots is getting the absolute stud golfers in situations where they're much lower owned than other studs. And I think that's probably my favorite thing that I'm going to take from last year that I'm hopefully been able to implement even more this year, as well as finding other ways to gain leverage with still keeping a good amount of equity with some of the mid-tier guys. One thing that I think last year I did a lot of that maybe was a big mistake was played some chalky guys in like the mid-range that everyone played and went more contrarian, kind of the low-end guys. Where I've had the most success is going contrarian with the high-end guys. Justin Thomas paid some big dividends last year, obviously. But, yeah, kind of a long tangent there. I'm trying to evaluate the best ways to get leverage while still keeping as much equity as possible.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And throughout the year, even in this tournament, we'll start to put some practical applications to that game theory segment there. The other question I have for these guys is just anything that we've learned from the last month and a half that we've been off. I think our last pod was in November. So from like a player evaluation standpoint, just like research, anything like that, or just thoughts on like last week, Pete? I know that you were talking right for the pod about DJ. Anything like the last month and a half that's standing out to you that we hadn't just hit on yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one nice thing, hopefully, will be Tiger being prevalent in golf. I think, if he can even be mildly competitive and a story every week, it's going to be amazing for golf, and it should be amazing for golf DFS. So that's the thing I'm definitely paying the most attention to, is just hopefully the popularity growing. In addition to that, which is somewhat related, which is going to make a challenge for Tiger, these guys are getting so freaking good. The depth of talent on the PGA Tour right now is just absolutely absurd. Tons of young guys coming up that are trending in the right direction. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how the year shakes out. But the two biggest things I'm cognizant of are the Tiger impact. Hopefully that grows the game, grows DFS, and then just the depth of talent and trying to identify guys we can be bullish on early with such a crowded kind of talent base that the PGA Tour now has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Colin, so we've been off for a little bit here, and one of the cool things about this pod, we do it almost all the way throughout the year, and we'll get weekly here from now on. But we can keep track of how players are doing on a week-by-week basis. But since we've been off, I think it's good to just recap if anything has changed. But my question to you is, has really anything changed? We've had some like lower end tournaments here. Now we're getting back into the bigger ones, but like some of these guys have been taking some time off. Like statistically for these golfers, has things changed a lot?
I tend to go no. There's probably, if anything, there's probably a little bit more uncertainty just because there's not as much of a recent sample for everyone here. With that being the case, like when you have that as the case, I think standard framework is just to assume everything froze since November and nothing's really changed since then. So it's kind of like, where do we last leave everyone? I'm sure there's an interesting angle as far as like certain people take a little bit more time to get warmed up or back in the swing of things. But yeah, I think that's the value of models is why when everyone else is trying to rack their brain on like what are people doing week to week and how did they do recently, the data is just still frozen there, so it's really easy to pick up right where you left off and kind of see what is everyone's long-term adjusted round, which doesn't care that they've only been off for 2 months.
Right. Yeah, the models don't take a week off, so we're grateful for that.
Data doesn't sleep.
Exactly. We need to get T-shirts that say that or something.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into this tournament here. Again, this is the Sony Open in Hawaii. If you don't remember last year, this was really the tournament that kicked off Justin Thomas's amazing year. He won the week before this tournament, the SBS Tournament of Champions, and then came into this Sony Open in Hawaii last season and just absolutely dominated, set the course record. He won by 7 strokes over Justin Rose, just absolutely crushed. He became just the 7th player in PGA Tour history to shoot a round under 60. He was the youngest guy to do so. During his first round, he opened with an eagle and closed with an eagle. I mean, like, the dude was just insane last year. So I want to give him props on that for sure. And so he is back in the field. We have Jordan Spieth in the field as well. But let's start just talking about the course. Colin, what sort of players do well here in Hawaii?
So there's honestly, there's not much of a course fit here, which is kind of surprising because the narrative around the Sony Open is it has these wide, forgiving fairways. And so everybody kind of leads bombers and picks the inaccurate drivers because there's not as much penalty. If anything, I think that's going to be overrated this year. And that kind of makes that's just looking at the lack of course fit alone. Distance hasn't really played like a significant. It's only played a significant role once, and that was last year. And then you have that countered by 2014. Bombers got a slight penalty, and so I think it kind of makes intuitive sense that there's not much of a fit because sure you have wide open fairways, but it's also par 70, so it's not like there are a whole lot of par fives to capitalize on that and lap the field. So I basically have this as much of a neutral course fit as you might imagine. So I think the edge is to maybe even fade the Bombers this week because I think they're probably going to be overrepresented both among recommendations and ownership.
Interesting. Yeah, Pete, what are you doing as far as model goes? Leaning on long-term adjusted round, I'm sure as always, but like how much weight are you going to give course history here?
A lot. I mean, I think that's the key here is you weight long-term adjusted round, course history, and if you want to tinker with some other categories that you would think make sense, I'm fine with it. Given that there's not really an accuracy or distance course based on Colin's explanation, I think that makes a lot of sense. And this comes in a great way to be contrarian. If consensus around the industry is that distance really matters, it's a great way. Is pick the guys who have good history, who are playing well, and you think rank well outside of the distance category, and load up on those guys. That's a great way to be contrarian. So I like that angle that Colin brought up, and yeah, it's interesting. There's obviously a good field here, and it's fun to watch and be envious of these guys golfing out in Hawaii.
So you guys are a little bit different in that, at least historically, maybe this has changed, but Colin, you, I think, skew more towards long-term metrics, and Pete likes to factor in a little bit more of the recent metrics. Pete, I'm curious, just because some of these guys, like Tony Finau, like some of these top guys have just not played in the last month. So, I mean, the recent metrics in our models are going to just default to their long-term metrics, but even the guys that have only played like once, are you going to like limit the weight for recent adjusted round or just recent metrics at all and just go more long-term since like the last month and a half hasn't been like a great sample of tournaments?
Yeah, I'll go more long-term. I'll take a little bit from last week, given that these guys are in Hawaii and we did see the best players in the world play last week. But for the most part, it's just long-term stuff that you're looking at here and trying to capture any guys that you're bullish on coming into the season. This could be a great place to start early with someone that, you're taking a stance on that you think is undervalued in the markets right now.
Cool. Let's get to the players. Let's start with some of the highest price options, and then we'll move our way down to the mid-tier and then get to the value guys that are standing out within our models here. Colin, I'll kick to you first. We have Jordan Spieth at $12K. He's the most expensive guy. We have the reigning champ and the reigning PGA Tour Player of the Year, Justin Thomas, at $11.6. Leishman at 11-1. So let's start with like maybe the main five guys, the guys that are in the triple digits, Brian Harman and Kevin Kisner, round that group out. What are your thoughts on the top tier?
So it's not surprising that Spieth is the highest price guy. And he's good, don't get me wrong, but I'm still half and half on whether or not he justifies his price. I mean, he had a good showing. He's already in Hawaii for the Tournament Champions, and it was a pretty decent result. But the dirty little secret is that Spieth actually has what I consider a net negative history at this course. It's a little bit of a small sample. It's a miscut and a third, so take it for what you will. But when you're at the top tier, like any miscut is just so devastating for any history. So maybe there's a reason to mitigate that one in particular. That's still up in the air, but just from pure history alone, it's not the most inspiring as results. Same thing, funnily enough, with Justin Thomas. Yeah, he won it, and he has a 6, but he also had a miscut in between there. So that's kind of coming out as a wash. So I don't think you can say either of those guys have absolute great history to bank off of. I'm hoping that they kind of get a little bit of a hype train going and people remember that, because I think the only guy in the top that has the history to justify it is, in fact, Mark Leishman, who I was kind of like it was funny to see him here, but he's played this course a ton. He's never really disappointed. I think that he's the only one in the top end that has the history to justify his price tag. Granted, the other two are Jordan Spieth and Justin Thomas, so it's not like they have no pedigree.
Right.
But if the play this week is load up on history, then it's actually Leishman that can be the only one that justifies his price tag.
Mm-hmm. Pete, what are your thoughts on the top tier, and especially how they've done historically here?
Yeah, I think Colin just gave a good explanation. I think it makes a lot of sense to look at some of these guys that people might not weight as much. I do think Leishman, he's the top of my model right now with course history. Makes a lot of sense because I think people will gravitate more towards Spieth and Justin Thomas. And Colin certainly makes an interesting argument there. Outside of that, I mean, I think you can look at these guys in the 10K range for ownership reasons. I mean, Harmon is definitely not the class of golfer that Leishman, Thomas, and Spieth are. It's kind of the same thing with Kevin Kisner. And if you want to play the accuracy game, I mean, Zach Johnson will probably be somewhat low owned. I know he's dipping down below 10K, but that high end range, ownership's going to be a big thing. I think the top 3 guys will be the most owned. That next 3 guy tier is kind of intriguing to me from an ownership standpoint. But want to hear more about Colin's opinion.
Yeah, Colin. So that was something we talked about in our game theory segment. Talk about like equity versus ownership. Like who is the best value in that way of thinking of things?
I think the top 3 guys are going to have like all of their ownership really like grouped together. So maybe you can't get away from them. If there's any guy where like value may overwhelm high ownership, it's probably going to be Leishman relative to his price. I think that the Zach Johnson is probably going to be the lowest owned of this group. But I've always been bearish on his long-term adjusted round in general. I think the similar play there is Webb Simpson, actually, who basically has maybe the same profile. I've kind of been similarly bearish on him, maybe a little bit less so, but has the history to overwhelm that. So that's probably my favorite from an ownership equity nexus at his price.
That's interesting. Just as a fun question before we get down to the lower this mid tier here, Pete, let's talk about JT. I'm curious, like if we're ranking golfers about just like when they are absolutely on and hot, like who is the best golfer? Like JT, like the dude can just rack up birdies more than anyone. Like where would he rank as far as like when the dude is on, like he's winning the tournament?
I mean, yeah, whenever these guys play their best, it's really tough to decipher. I mean, between Dustin Johnson, Spieth, JT, I don't know if Jason Day is going to be able to regain that form that we saw a year and a half ago where it was ridiculous as well. I mean, all these guys are so freaking good. But, yeah, Justin Thomas is right there at the top of the list. We didn't even mention Rory, who's obviously not in this field. But, yeah, the top echelon group of golfers, I mean, when they're all playing doesn't seem like we see A+ versus A+ very often. I guess we saw that with Mickelson and Stenson in the Open Championship in 2016. But, Justin Thomas is right there. I mean, the dude's on fire. It was obviously a birdie machine last year. And I'm interested to see how he plays here in this spot. I just think he'll be relatively low-owned, or relatively high-owned at this price tag. I think people will gravitate to him and Spieth a lot, even though Leishman has elite course history, just because the odds to win are so much higher for those guys and the name pedigree.
Yeah, I think he's going to be pretty high owned. I mean, he won this tournament by 7 strokes last year, set the course record, and then won the most recent major that we've had. So I think he's going to be definitely on people's minds. Let's dip down just a little bit. We've talked about ZJ and Webb Simpson in that 9K range, but let's we can group them into guys that are just 8K and above. So we'll go down to like Chaz Reavie, talk about these mid-tier guys like Finau, Howell, Berger, etc. Colin, why don't you give your thoughts on this top tier, or this mid-tier, sorry.
All right, what range are we doing here, 7 to 9?
Yeah, just down to like 8K, down to your boy Chaz.
Thank you for including him just like right in the middle. I think Finau and Berger, I mean, being the top price here, probably make the most sense just from pure equity standpoint. They're both fine. I really am interested to see like if there's some dumb angle about people assuming that Finau is Hawaiian because it sounds Hawaiian. He's born in Utah. Please don't play that angle. It's not the same thing. And it is fun. So I basically have Finau, Berger, and Xander, like from a pure equity standpoint, right up there. I basically agree with all those. Interestingly enough, the guy that has the best history here by far is Charles Howell. I think like I could see as of now, I don't have his ownership being super high, but I think as recommendations come in, everybody loves to recommend Howell generally, just because he's so consistent. He was probably one of the toughest ones I had last year on fade versus equity ownership, just because there's something to be saying about being so consistent in certain spots, a la Matt Kuchar. So assuming Charles gets the same tout level and his ownership goes up, I still don't know what to do with him from a game theory perspective. So he's going to be the most confounding. But yeah, other than that, I think if I had to go like maybe a pivot from that, I think Jamie Lovemark has a decent, like arguably the same level of history at a cheaper price tag. He's higher risk reward, but we're all trying to win the GPP, so we don't mind taking on risk.
Pete, what are your thoughts on this mid-tier? Looking at our projected ownership right now, among these guys in like the 8 to 9K range here, it looks like we have like Berger, Finau, Lovemark as like 3 of the more popular ones from this tier. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that those guys will all come in heavily owned. I think, they're from an equity standpoint, it makes sense why they're going to be heavily owned. It's tricky when you're going through trying to figure out how to navigate this tier. Certainly a lot of value with a lot of these guys, and you can make an argument to make a really balanced squad that kind of leads with like 2 or 3 of these players. So my favorite play and the most trends is probably Finau. I'm still really bullish on him coming into the season, and started to catch up last year. People started to play him. He had that amazing stretch, but might be still a little bit undervalued, especially relative to his price on DraftKings. So equity-wise, he's my favorite. If I had to pick one for ownership, gets really tricky. I'd probably dip down a little bit lower to someone like Ollie Schneiderjans or maybe Xander, and bet one of those young guys to kind of keep trending in the right direction. We'll see, but it's a tough tier. I mean, I don't have a ton of conviction because I think it's priced relatively fairly, and the guys that stand out like a Finau, I think are going to soak up a lot of ownership. So tough tier in my opinion.
Yeah, Colin, do you think that some of these guys are like we always have to deal with the dynamic of like just how popular the like 10, 11K, 12K guys are going to be and how that affects the ownership? So, when you're looking at ownership, are you looking at like just how popular the most popular guy is supposed to be? And like how does that usually affect, like what's the correlation between his ownership and the guys in this mid-tier?
Yeah, I think that kind of gets into almost like a new meta metric that I am interested in exploring this year, which is kind of like correlation of ownerships. So like the analogy in like MLB would be like everyone knows stacking, right? Where like if like some guy goes off relative to his projection, someone else will go off like as well, right? You can kind of do the same thing on ownership where like if everybody gravitates towards the high end players, like they're going to need value and low tier to like fill it out. So those guys will be more owned, right? So you can almost do like if you can think about ownership as the same thing as like fantasy equity, where if someone is higher owned relative to projection, someone else is also going to be higher owned. And I think that's some truly next level stuff that I would love to incorporate. Almost like ownership stacking, which like I don't know if we just invented a term here, but like or even how much that moves the needle relative to something like MLB stacking, which has real risk. I think that is a fun way to think about it. Yeah, that kind of goes into who like why would ownership projections be off though? Because that's not like the randomness of sports. That's a randomness of pinning down where everybody's kind of, where everyone's trending and following recommendations.
That's an interesting topic. Pete, do you think about stuff like that when you're putting together GPP lineups? I mean, we even have it in like NBA. Like if you're going to roster Russell Westbrook at 11, 12K, like you're going to have to get a 3, 4K guy on DraftKings.
Yeah,
so
that's how I always think about it. I mean, that's the best way to do it. I mean, in terms of roster construction, that's how you always gain the biggest edges from an ownership standpoint. You find some roster construction that is going to be contrarian because everyone's going to be loading up on X, Y, and Z players, and you find the most equity in that route, and you have a lot of leverage versus the field because a variety of these guys end up failing, and you're in a great spot.
Cool. Let's dip down to the lower tier here. Let's go guys just below 8K, guys that are standing out within our models. Colin, I'll kick back to you again on this one.
Mute. You're on mute, Colin.
All right, who do we got here? I think below 8K, the most interesting name is probably going to be Kyle Stanley. Everyone, like the Kyle Stanley death train is kind of like a known, do we ride or not, yes or no. I think he'll be popular this week just because like the odds for his price, which determines so much of ownership, are going to be really high. And other than that, I think, and he has history to boot, so I think like a lot of that is justified. In a similar boat, I think Gary Woodland is going to have decent history, and kind of like, it's really tough to pick them out so far. Maybe Woodland will have a little bit less ownership. And other than that, yeah, I think Peter Uihlein is probably going to be the third most highest owned. I still don't know what to make of him. I get there's hype around him. There's lineage there. He's related to the ball manufacturers and all of that. But, like, I don't know. Like, he's the biggest question mark so far. And I have faded him a lot on aggregate, and I don't feel so bad about it yet. So I think those are going to be probably the most popular names. Maybe Jason Duffner, because everyone's going to be really surprised to see him all the way down at 7,300. But I think his string of results actually do justify him being that low.
Yeah, Woodland is really interesting. If you're looking at just like the last 5 years, you could argue, I mean, like JT obviously destroyed this course last year, but just in the aggregate, Woodland might have the best course history of any player here. 6th place last year, 13th the year before, and 3rd place in 2015. So he's been in the top 15 each year with a couple really, really close finishes. Pete, what are your thoughts on Woodland and then other guys that are standing out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I like Woodland in general. I wonder if he's going to get touted in a big way because if people get behind the bomber angle, he's going to make a lot of sense, especially at his price tag. I think he's going to be super heavily owned, so tournament fade, and he's definitely in consideration in cash. I'm high on Austin Cook. I mean, this guy is just someone that makes – I knew that Colin was going to hate this, but this guy is just like hitting so many greens for so long now. Like the web.com data was ridiculous, but – I don't know. I like every time I watch this guy, it's just like he just gets in the fairway, gets it on the green. If he misses the fairway, doesn't miss by much, and then he's on the green again. So I don't know. Maybe this is where he starts to regress, but he's been so impressive in terms of just like the way he's able to hit greens. I mean, 79.2% in terms of his short-term green regulation percentage. 72.6% long-term. That's just ridiculous. I know he's been playing on the web.com tour, but pretty big fan of him.
I actually don't hate it per se, not in the reason that you think. It's just kind of going back to, I remember when he first debuted on tour and he was like just putting up ridiculous web.com numbers and, he came in at like 20th ranked in the world. That was something like 2 years ago. So it's like that weird question of, was I onto something back then and it only took 2 years to come to fruition? Like, is there some sort of long arc there? Or is it all just a coincidence? I lean coincidence, honestly. That's just you can always like find blips that happened years ago and someone gets hot again. So I think that's pretty tough to distinguish from randomness. So I don't know. It's just like a weird, like, did I miss something with Austin Cook? Where has he been this whole time? Why was he on the web.com after his initial good run? So I just don't know what to do with him. That's all. It's confounding.
Pete, you've been riding some of these like young guys. It was Xander, I think, most recently. Looking to 2018, are there any guys that you are bullish on?
Yeah, there's a bunch of guys I think are going to be pretty nice plays. I mean, obviously we got Xander and Ollie that are interesting. That Alabama kid, his name's eluding me right now. That's just coming on tour. What's his? You know what I'm talking about, Colin?
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
Let me look it up. Yeah, there's. I mean, and then the thing is, like, the problem is, like, a lot of these guys who are really young are already well established. Justin Thomas, Spieth, these guys are young. Like that's the hardest part is trying to decipher that stuff. I mean, John Rahm was an easy one last year, so I think it's like McNeely or something like that. That I can't find him. Let's see here.
Maverick McNeely.
Yeah, that's someone I've heard a ton of hype around. He's only 22 years old. He's the number 1 ranked world amateur. People are pretty behind him in the golf world, so I'm definitely paying attention to him. Yeah, I mean, once we get into full-blown golf season, I'll have some stronger takes, but there's some really, really good young players, and these guys who are already established are young too. So it's just the game's in great hands right now with these players.
Yeah, and some of the best established players are still like, 23 or 24, which is just ridiculous.
That is nuts.
I know. Yeah, like you think of like the guys here, like Spieth and JT, you think of them as like veterans and they're under 25. It's insane. All right, well, let's end it with before we get to picks, let's talk about maybe our favorite play under 5% ownership. Colin, why don't you kick it off?
God, I think I go back and forth on if it's a good one or not, but definitely under 5%, I can see the merit is James Hahn. He comes up a bunch, and he's paid off in certain spots, so I don't feel bad going back to the well. But definitely, I think so far flying under the radar with the history he has here so far. Hasn't missed a cut, but hasn't really hit top 25 all that well. So that's kind of that classic, what do you do with that? How much do you believe in upside? I don't mind. I mean, given that, like, I kind of lean towards if someone is like rock solid towards making a cut, like that's the only thing you can predict, and like once in a while it'll go off from there. But definitely low owned. I probably my favorite under 5%.
I dig it. Pete, what about you?
Yeah, it's tricky. I was looking at like O'Hare and Scott Brown initially as low owned guys. I wish Hudson Swafford we had projected for a little bit lower owned because I'd I'd go there. It's tough. I mean, I don't have a ton of guys that I think are going to do great. I want to root for Tom Lovelady because all those guys are friends with him, but he's probably not a great equity play. Yeah, I guess if I had to pick one, it'd be one of those two guys. I don't know. Do you have a preference there, Colin?
I mean, Swafford's pretty good. I mean, I could see Swafford.
But he's going to be more heavily owned. I would take Swafford for sure. Do you have a preference out of Scott Brown and Sean O'Hare?
Probably Brown by a smidge, but like not strong conviction.
Yeah. What about you, Bryan? Who are you liking as a sleeper?
Sorry. Yeah. Once you get to under 5, it's tough. I mean, there are some like interesting guys that are in like the tier right above that, like the 5 to 8% ownership. So you're talking like Emiliano Grillo and like Luke List, Kokrak and stuff like that. They're projected around 5% ownership, but getting to like the little bit lower tier than that is tough. So we'll see. I like you guys' call. Hans really stood out to me. He was the guy that I was looking at. You guys want to pick some winners? Get out of here.
Sounds good.
Cool. Pete, why don't you take number 1? Colin, you can have number 2, and I'll take third.
All right, I'll take Spieth, even though I know ownership. But if I have the first pick, I'm taking guy as the favorite.
Okay.
I am going off odds here, and or away from odds, I should say. I'm gonna go Leishman.
All right, you will twist my arm and make me take Justin Thomas, who won by 7 strokes last year, and the PGA Championship a couple months ago. That was tough. That was really tough for me to pick. Let's go under 9K. Is that fine?
Yeah.
I guess. Let's see here. So the obvious one. Yeah, so there's a couple, I think, obvious ones here. I'm going to go Berger over Finau, though.
Interesting. Yeah, you're handing it to me. I got to go Finau.
All right, I'll take Charles Howell. Actually, no, he never wins. What am I doing?
Yeah, that's his whole thing.
That was a really, really borderline like almost a disastrous pick.
I twitched in my eye. Like, what do you think?
I was just looking at the highest rated guy in the model instead of thinking about the twin odd. If you want to see something amazing, by the way, go look at Charles Howell's like record lifetime and how much money this guy's won. He is just a printing press that never wins. So
yes, that is that is the life, just always under the radar.
Yeah, he still has like somewhat decent odds. I mean, not decent, but he still has like whatever, something to win. But I'll go Man, I guess I'm going to go Xander as the next guy for his equity to win. I'm tempted to go someone like Woodland, but I'll go Xander.
All right, I dig it. Okay, we will end it there. Thank you guys for listening or watching. As always, it is good to be back talking some golf. We'll be back regularly every week, every Tuesday moving forward here. So thanks for listening. Good luck this week, and we'll talk to you guys next week.